If you like sexy gradients, then this video is for you because we're going to be experimenting with some experimental gradient experiments. So here we are in After Effects and we have 3 folders to get through, but we're going to start with this moving gradient blur and I'm going to break down this process. So for starters, we have all these shape layers down here and I'm going to solo these layers and you can see that there are just a bunch of circles, some black circles, some white circles, and some 50% gray circles. And then we have a black solid for the background. For starters, I'm going to go up to this adjustment layer. So I'm going to solo that layer and go to the effects controls. And I'm going to turn all of these off and talk through them individually. So I'm going to start with a scale wipe. As you can see, it stretches the object around a central anchor point. So I want to keep that anchor point in the center. You can see if I increase the stretch, this is what happens. You can also change the direction of the stretch like this. As you can see, I have an expression applied to this. So I'm going to double tap E to open up the expressions. You can see it is just a value plus time expression so that this number slowly increases across the timeline. Now I'm going to turn this off for now and we'll turn them back on later. But I just want to show you what happens without them and what they do. So let's continue by bringing on the second scale wipe, which is now in the opposite direction. Then I added a directional blur with a 80-degree angle, and this doesn't have to be exact. And then I set the blur length to 500 and that gives us this. Then the last thing I did was increase the contrast because I wanted to bring in more of the black and increase the white as well. So this is what that looks like. And now before we turn on these expressions, I want to turn on this adjustment layer here called motion. And what I've done here is just added a motion tile. So again, we have some expressions applied. I'm going to double tap E. I'm going to pull this down. For now, I'm just going to turn off this adjustment layer so we can just look at the shapes themselves and see exactly what this motion is doing. So if I hit play, you can see that this is just scrolling past, and that's what the motion tile does. So if I were to remove this expression and just move this down, it just duplicates the edges so that you can tile them essentially. So what I've done with this expression is add a time expression here, time times 600 to the X value. So if I turn this back on, this just repeats without me having to keyframe anything. The way I set that up is very simple. I came in and if I just hit enter twice here, and pick whip one of these layers, you get this code automatically written for you. So that's how I created this expression. I knew that I needed to have an X and a Y value for the X and the Y, the end, and then I just created these 2 variables, X and Y, and I just pick whipped each value just like this. Of course, each one of these lines needs to have a semicolon to end the line. And then I just came back to the first line and went plus time times 600. So that will be the value plus time times 600. And that will just animate this seamlessly without us having to keyframe. Okay, so I'm going to close that up and I'm going to turn this back on as well. And we have all of these on now, but we haven't turned back on our expressions because I just want to show you what that looks like right here. And already I think that's pretty interesting. What I decided to do with the time expressions was create a more automated animation out of this. So I'm going to turn them on. Let's turn off the directional blur. And all it's doing is increasing the direction over time on each one of these. So let's turn that back on. The last thing I did was add some color and noise, starting with the CC toner effect and set it to Pentone so I could edit 5 colors. And I just input these manually. And then of course, grain on gradients is always a nice aesthetic. So I dropped that on using a noise HLS set to grain with 5% lightness. And this is what that looks like. And I think this experiment is pretty interesting, but of course we're experimenting with experimental experiments here. So let's do something with this. So here is the first thing I did with this experimental gradient, and I think it's pretty dope. So let's take a look at how I did it. So for starters, I'm going to solo this layer here and I'm going to remove the matte. So I just brought in our gradient into a new comp and then I dropped in this type. So let's turn that on. Then the next thing I did was use our text as a matte for our gradient. So let's turn off our text layer now. So the gradient is moving inside of the text layer. Now I brought in another one of our moving gradients, except this time I scaled it up to 110 to differentiate it from the text and make the text feel a bit like glass. So it has this almost translucent feel to it. And then finally, I created all of these highlights, and as you can see, they're also set matted to the type. But if I remove this matte, you can see that these are just a bunch of white circles with a fastbox blur with an overlay blending mode. So I'm going to set up the matte again. See that our highlights are matted to our type, and it just means I can add a little bit more visual interest and make the type stand out against the background. and there you have it. So now we're moving on to our gradient cube. So let's get into it. Let's start with the background. I'm just going to solo this layer so you can see exactly what I've done. This is just our same moving gradient, but I've used the version without the grain, so I can drop in a fastbox blur and another grain on top of that. Now, the next thing I did was create this map square, and I did this inside of the advanced 3D renderer because that automatically creates this lighting effect. But let me just quickly show you how I did that. So I'm going to unsolo these and I'm going to create a new square just like that. I'm going to solo that layer and let's make sure the anchor point is centered. We can just also align this to the center of our composition. Now I'm going to twirl down the contents and I'm going to go to rectangle path and I'm going to make sure that this is just 400 by 400. Then I'm going to toggle the switch so I can turn this into a 3D layer, and that opens up these geometry options and material options. I'm going to twirl down geometry options and make our extrusion depth 400. And that just means that we'll have a perfect three-dimensional square with equal sides. Now what I'm going to do is hit A on our keyboard and I'm going to change to 2 views so you can see what's happening a little bit better. And I'm going to make this 200. You can see that pushes the whole square forward and centers our anchor point because our square is 400 by 400, so 200 will be the exact middle. The next step was to open up our rotation properties and just rotate this along the Y and along the X. Somewhere around there, I just eyeballed it. As you saw from the example, this was moving in a kind of random way, and the way that I did that was just dropping time expressions onto each of these. So time times 50, time times 100, and time times 75. Something along those lines will do. And you can see that just gives us this random rotating behavior. Okay, so I'm just going to delete this so we can talk about the rest of the animation. And I'm going to change this back to one view. Now let's get back to where we were. So here we have our background and our map square. And then I brought in another instance of our moving gradient. So I'll turn that back on and I'll take off the displacement map. I'm also going to solo just that layer so you can see what's going on. Now I created a map which is just a duplicate of this map square, and I used that as a matte for this layer, so I'm just going to undo that. So here we have our moving gradient and I dropped on a displacement map, and just to give you a sense of what the displacement map does, I'm going to turn these both back to 0. The way that the displacement map works is that it shifts the position of your objects according to how dark or light the values are. And I have a much more detailed explanation of how this effect works, and I'll link to that video below. So if we apply the displacement map effect, I'm just going to quickly reset this, turn that back on. As you can see, nothing happens. But if we go and set this to our map square, you can see we get a slight shift, and that is because we have 5 set on both of these values. If I increase that, you can see what starts to happen. It's taking this background layer and it's moving it according to the grayscale values on our map square. So you can make this a bit subtle or not too intense, and you'll get that almost glass-like feel with this particular background. And I think this is already pretty cool and definitely something that you can experiment with. But of course, this is not where I ended up because I wanted to do something slightly different with the background. So I'll turn that back on. And the way I was able to get the background to appear was, again, using this map square as a matte. So I'm going to set that up again, and there you have it. So moving forward, the last thing I did was play around with having a little circle inside here. But let me remove this matte so you can see what's going on. So I have a duplicate of the moving gradient var, and we have our circle, and I simply use that as a matte. If I just solo that, you can see what's going on. And the reason it's so light is because I've set this to overlay at 30%, and this is the final result, and I think it's pretty interesting. Our next experiment is a really simple one, so let's go into our moving gradient liquid, and I'll just play this for you. So once again, I'm just messing around with that original moving gradient, seeing what else I can do with it. So with this one, I just brought in our moving gradient var, so that's the one without the grain, and added a turbulent displace. Let me turn off the noise for now. So let me quickly reset this so you can see how I did it. So I just increased the amount to somewhere around 200, and I increased the size to somewhere around 400. And you can see that we're just stacking a single effect on top of our original, and it just gives us a much more interesting result. We're getting this liquidy feel, which I find highly satisfying. The next thing we're going to look at is our RGB gradient. And I've become very fascinated with RGB colors recently, so I thought I would do a gradient where we explored this a bit more. But for starters, let's take a look at this. You can see that we have 3 circles. One's fully red, one's fully green, and one is fully blue. and then there's just a black background. Now if we change the blending mode here to add, you can see that these layers start to blend, and within them they're forming magenta, cyan and yellow. Of course, when all three of them overlap, we get white. And I think this is already a really interesting interaction and something that we can play around with. So in the next experiment, that's exactly what we do. So let's go to the RGB base. So we have these RGB colors moving and morphing in this kind of undulating way, and it's quite satisfying. So let's take a look at how I did this. And this technique is actually the first half of the process of creating the disc in this animation from the Pro Motion Techniques Masterclass. With this short course, my goal is to teach you a bunch of pro level techniques and workflow in under 3 hours. I don't want to spin any yarns here or make any outlandish claims, but if you want to improve and add some really useful techniques to your creative arsenal in the cheapest way possible, this is for you. I can guarantee you'll level up by learning how to create this animation, which I've jam-packed with specialized techniques. So check it out now at the link in the description. So let's take a look at how to make this. So for starters, I'm going to turn off our adjustment layer. I'm going to solo our black solid, and then let's bring on our red, and you can see that this is simply made up of a bunch of circles within a single layer, and I have a time expression on the rotation, so it just constantly rotates just like that. Then I'll turn on our green layer, and there we just have the same kind of thing happening, a bunch of green circles set up in a single shape layer, rotating, this time in the opposite direction. And of course I have all of these set to add as blending modes so that we get the overlapping colors. So here we're starting to bring in the yellow. Now let's turn on our blue. Now you can see we're starting to get the magenta as well as the white coming into play. And again, time expression to make this constantly rotate just like this. Let's go take a look at our adjustment layer. So I'm going to solo this, and I've turned all of these off, but let's bring them on individually. So the fast box blur simply blurs everything out. You want to make sure that your repeat edge pixels is on, or you get that blurring on the edges, and that's pretty much it. And the reason I brought on the brightness and contrast effect was to up the contrast. As you can see, that looks a lot better. Now this on its own is not really doing much. However, you can do a lot of interesting things with this, as you can see in my Pro Motion Techniques Masterclass, but we're going to do something interesting with it right now as well. So let's move on. So the next thing we're going to look at is our RGB waves. So let's start with our RGB base, and I'm just going to remove all of these effects. If I hit S to open up our scale, you can see that I've scaled this up slightly. So I'm going to take that back down. So we've reset everything. And now I'm going to turn on the wave warp. I'm going to reset this. So for starters, we're going to increase the wave height, and I set that around 80, and then the wave width, and I set that to around 120, and then I'm going to set this to circle. That starts to give us something a little bit more interesting. We have this almost three-dimensional feel to it. Now I've set the direction to 90 degrees, so this will actually move in that direction, but for this effect we don't want this to continue moving, so I'm going to set this to 0. You can see that just remains static because we already have a lot of movement inside of our RGB base. Now you can also start to see why I increased the scale in the Y direction. I'm just going to increase that back up to 120 to get rid of those black edges. The next thing I'm going to do before we get to the CC Reptile is drop in a warp effect. So let's reset this, and I'm going to change this to vertical, and you can see that there's some interesting things happening with this warp effect. So you can play around with these. I think arch is also quite interesting. You can see when we play this we get this morphing feel, which is very nice. But for the look we're going for, I set this to flag, and as you can see, this is what it gives us. But the problem here is that it creates these black edges, and I wanted to remove that, and that's why we have our CC Reptile. If I set this to 0 and this to 0, all I did was expand this to the right and expand it to the left. And there you have it, your first post for your generative art Tumblr account. Now moving on to this next folder, we're just going to look at a few random experiments that I made. So for starters, we're going to look at this tunnel. Once again, a perfect post for your generative art Tumblr account. But let's take a look at how I did it. So once again, we just have a black BG, which I've locked. Let's start soloing these layers one at a time. As you may have noticed throughout these experiments, I always start in grayscale and then I color after, because I think you can get very interesting results that way. So here we have a circle with a radial gradient. Now let's turn on this inner cover, and this is very simply a shape layer made out of this gray color. What I did was add a fast box blur to slightly blur these edges. Very simple. But again, this is setting up a sort of a map for our color effects. The next thing I did here was blur out these edges, and that's just to improve the look of this map. So I'm going to turn on this adjustment layer. What I did here was create an adjustment layer with two masks, And if I twirl down to our masks, you can see that I've feathered both of these out so that we get this even blurring. Next thing that I did was create this rotation. So as you can see, I have a center line here, and I've set up this edge just off the center line. So if I turn on our rotation null, that is perfectly in the center. So everything at the bottom here is parented to our rotation, and if I double tap E to open up our expressions, you can see that once again I'm using a time times 100 expression, and that just creates this automatic rotation. And now let's move on to our Colorama effect, and this is where the magic happens. So let's turn this on, and what the Colorama effect does is that it maps whatever colors you put into the output cycle onto your grayscale colors from black to white. And if I just double tap E, I've added an expression to this, time times -100, but I'm going to turn this off quickly just to show you how it works. So what I'm doing is I'm animating the phase shift here. So if I move forward, you can see that the color stays exactly the same because these colors are being mapped onto the grayscale here, and we don't have a full black or a full white, so we won't see the full spectrum of colors here. So let me turn this back on. So a way to create movement in this is to animate the phase shift. So let me show you what that looks like. So you can see now why I'm going in a negative direction, because it feels more like these colors are coming out of the tunnel. So let me turn this expression back on, and that's going to constantly animate this phase shift. And I don't think this is a finished product by any means, but certainly something to experiment with, and I think the result is pretty interesting. Okay, let's move on to our Colorama donut. And as you can see, our Tumblr account is really growing with this one, so let's take a look at how I did it. So let's solo our map layer, and once again, starting in grayscale and coloring afterwards is pretty much the MO here, especially when it comes to these kinds of experiments. So let me quickly show you how I made that. Once again, an outer circle, and this just has a radial gradient. Then we have an inner circle, and this over here is also a radial gradient on an object, but I've set this up so that it goes to alpha on the right so that we see the background coming through. And then I just used this mask with a strong feather to blur this out. And then I just wanted to make that a little bit darker, and that's why I just popped in another one of these. And that's how we created our map. So let me go out, and what I did to the map on this side is dropped in a fast box blur to blur out this edge. Now let's take a look at this comp here, a Colorama gradient. So inside here we have a moving gradient, and the way I created this was, for starters, creating a gradient ramp from black to white, and then dropping on a Colorama effect. And as you know, the Colorama effect will apply from black to white. So if I pop this on, you can see that these colors are applying in their full spectrum according to our gradient ramp colors. And then once again, I've animated the phase shift, so I'll double tap E, and there you have it. So going back, I'm gonna solo this layer. So let's turn this back on, and it's set, of course, to our map. I'm gonna take these both to 0. If I pull this out, you can see that we start to move the gradient, and that's what gives us this result. And of course, the last thing I did was add a noise to this, because noise and gradients are a match made in heaven, and this is just going to make our Tumblr account look even more awesome. Now, before we move on, I just want to show you another example of this. So let me turn on this RGB gradient version, and this is another variation of that morphing RGB gradient, and the rest is pretty much the same as before, so I'll let you check it out for yourselves by grabbing the free project files at the link below. And the dopamine spike we're going to get from all the likes on our Tumblr account after posting this bad boy is going to be unreal. Moving on, let's get into our final experiment, this spinning gradient. So let's take a look before I break it down. Okay, so let's solo this pre-layer and double click to get in, and here you can see we have a fractal noise applied to a solid layer where I've animated the evolution with a time times 100 expression. I also added in a fastbox blur, so let's turn that off, as well as our curves layer, which colors everything. And I'm just going to reset this fractal noise so you can see how basic it was to create. So all I did was increase the contrast slightly, increase the brightness, increase the scale, and decrease the complexity to around 1. And that gives us this, but I'm just going to reset to our original. And the last thing I did was add a fastbox blur, and that gives us this. Now, for our color layer, I just created a new adjustment layer with a curves effect, and then I just changed all these individual curves to get this. Now, going back to our spinning gradient, let's take a look at the effects that I applied to this pre-layer. So for starters, a polar coordinates effect. So let's reset this. All you need to do here is change the conversion to rectipolar and then increase this to 100, and that gives us this. Now let's reset the optics compensation and turn this back on. And if I increase this to just over 100, you can see what starts to happen. And we want the opposite of this, so you can click reverse lens distortion and that gives us this. Now the next thing we need to do is get rid of this line. So what I did was add an adjustment layer with a Fastbox blur, set to 70, repeating edges once again, and then if I hit M, you can see that I've applied 2 masks. Let's turn this on, and as you can see, that just blurs out this middle bit here, and I've also applied a mask feather to feather out these edges on either side. And then I did the same thing with mask 2, and that's just to get rid of that little bit of line right there. Now let's take a look at our twirl. So here we've got keyframes animating the twirl, and if I open up our pre-layer, you can see that we have keyframes as well animating the rotation. So let's turn this back off so we can focus on just the rotation of this layer here. So if we go into the graph edit, take a look at these, you can see that I'm animating from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And I've set up the keyframes so that they animate very quickly at this point and slow down, and then animate very quickly and slow down. And you can see these are slightly above the center line. So if I select this, double click, you can see I have continuous, lock outgoing to incoming, and that allows me to lift up this handle so it doesn't come to a full stop at this point. If you want to learn more about this, I have another tutorial about easing in After Effects, which you can check out. Let's now turn on our twirl again, and our twirl is animated to work with this rotation. So once again here, I have the same easing with a bit of continuous movement in between. So with the twirl, I'm animating from 20 degrees to 100 degrees, back to 20 and back to 100. So our twirl is sort of turning on and off based on the intensity of the rotation and the speed of the rotation. So to finalize this, I just created an edge blur and a vignette, and the way I did this was adding another adjustment layer with a mask right on the edges, and as you can see, that mask has also been feathered, and I just added a Fastbox blur which blurs out these edges to hide any imperfections, and then the brightness and contrast effect. So if I turn that on, you can see I just decreased the brightness and slightly increase the contrast. And then of course we had to add a noise to finalize the look. I hope you've learned some cool techniques and tips from this tutorial and are inspired to create your own gradient experiments to add to your Tumblr page. And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more MotionXP.